Good evening, everybody. It is Thursday. I am reliably informed. I hope you are well. And I hope you've enjoyed some sunshine again today. We're blessed with this weather at the moment. Sorry to keep banging on about it. Actually, no, I'm not sorry to keep banging on about it. I think it's important to enjoy this weather. And when we've only got an hour or so each day to get outside, it's good that it's sunny when we do so. And I'm getting a bit of a tan from my daily walk and run. All good. So tonight we have got Shirish Kulkarni as our special guest. And Shirish is a journalist and news storytelling researcher. And we're going to be discussing what is wrong with the news at the moment, how it's presented and how it can be done better. So really interesting topic. Shirish has done a lot of research on this area. And there's going to be some tips, I think, at the end also about how we can consume media mindfully ourselves, especially during this time where we may be finding ourselves addicted to it or having some negative impacts on our mental health and general well-being from the following the pandemic on the news. So some tips on that, but generally it's all about storytelling and how we can do news better than the way we currently do. So before we get into that, I'm going to do a little sales pitch again, because tomorrow it is my first online. Ooh, why did Siri just wake up then? I don't know why that just happened. I do apologise. It's my first online mental health aware first day course, half day course even. So if you'd like to come along, it's only £75. And if you can't afford that, please get in touch with me. And I'm happy to offer some kind of concession or payment plan or whatever to suit you. Happy to be very flexible and try and get this out there to as many people as possible. So 1 till 5 tomorrow. And do come along. It's a really good course. You need to let me know tonight, really, if you're coming along, or first thing in the morning at the latest. Thank you very much. So if you've got any questions for Shirish as we go through this discussion, then you can just put them in the comments. If you want your name to pop up so we can see who you are, go to that link there. And just a reminder, can you please share the group with anyone that you think is going to benefit from it? And that would be great if we can grow our wonderful, supportive community. So without further waffling from me, why has my screen just gone all big? I'm having lots of technical things going on today. There we go. Oh, blimey. Crikey. That's all a bit weird. I do apologise. I've got, all I can see is my massive face. I'm gonna bring Shirish in and then start trying to make this screen normal size again. So Shirish, hello sir, and welcome.
Hi Paul, thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. And have you been enjoying some sunshine today, sir?
I have. I haven't been outside much because I've been working, because I work from home generally anyway. But I think after this I might go for a quick walk up the road. Luckily I live in the countryside, so I've got lovely kind of walking right from the door.
Lovely, lovely. Okay, so I've done a kind of brief introduction to you there, but maybe you can spend a bit of time introducing yourself, what you do, and why you do it. Would that be okay?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Shirish. I have been a journalist for 25 years now, I guess. So I originally started as a trainee at ITN, so worked all over ITN. So Channel 4 News, Channel 5 News, ITV News. I did about 5-6 years there, and then went to work at Sky News for around 15 years. And then about 6 years ago, I moved home really to Wales and went freelance. And so since then, I've been doing a mix of things really. So I've done a lot of freelance investigations mostly for the BBC, for the BBC's network news team based in Wales. Essentially, I work largely with the UK-wide News' Wales correspondent, if that makes sense. So any of the stories you see on the 6 and 10 News, which come from Wales, are done by the Wales correspondent. And I work with him mostly doing those bigger, longer-term investigations. So some people might be aware of the British Steel pension scandal of kind of a year ago, 18 months ago, where hundreds of people, unfortunately, were ripped off by dubious financial advisors. So that was my story. That was 6 months of my life kind of uncovering that. I've also done kind of bigger investigations on the radicalization of young people by the far right, which was probably 6 years ago now, 5 or 6 years ago now. So a little bit before it became fashionable is the wrong word, but before it became part of the kind of, the public debate around it, really. And various other things, particularly around, in terms of mental health, I've obviously brought a lot of my own experience into the work I've done. So I've done 2 big investigations, which made headlines kind of across the world, really, on the over-prescription of antidepressants and ADHD drugs to young people in particular. So that's kind of most of my journalistic career. And then the last year, I now do 2 things mostly. So I still do some freelance journalism, but I work a couple of days a week for an organisation called the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. So I work for them, actually not as a journalist, as what's called a community organiser. So I work with a network of people who are engaged with the Bureau Local, which is a little team I work for, doing local journalism. So my job with them is to engage with a network, very much as you're doing here, and to kind of activate that network and get as many people involved in that local public interest journalism as possible. And then the rest of the time, I've been doing, what you described, this news storytelling research. So I won a grant to look at the way we tell the news, starting really, I guess, from the basis that what we're doing is failing on a lot of levels. Fewer people are watching the news. I mean, there's been a bit of a bump because of coronavirus, but actually there's lots of evidence already showing some research done by Neiman Labs recently, which shows that bump has already dissipated because people are sort of, I guess, overwhelmed by a lot of that news. And we'll talk a bit about that later on. But starting with the principle that what we're doing is failing, and thinking, we can do it better. There are different ways of doing journalism. We'd start really at kind of a brass tacks analysis of what we think journalism is for.
It's a really good summary, thank you. And it sounds like a very interesting journey you've been on, and I wonder if is that fed by your own kind of personal curiosity into researching various different aspects of news and life in general?
Yeah, I think so. I would say I'm definitely a curious person. And I think around journalism, I've always been the person saying, why do we do it like this? Because it doesn't always make sense to me. And actually, that's, I don't want to make out I'm some kind of savant, who knows kind of better than anyone else. But actually, it's a question that's probably too rarely asked. And I think that's true of all industries. I think we've all been in jobs where actually you just do things because that's the way they've been done in the past. And I think that's very much what it is in journalism. It's just we do that because of the way it's been done. So a really good example. So most of my background is in broadcast journalism. But if you watch the headlines on the 6 o'clock news tonight or the 10 o'clock news tonight, the headlines will be read out will be written and read as if they're newspaper headlines. No, it's not a newspaper. And actually, we don't have the same constrictions or the same, the same restrictions on, the number of words, or it doesn't have to fit in a particular spot on the page. But actually, that just happened because the first TV journalists, the first radio journalists, were originally newspaper journalists. And so they just transferred those skills to broadcast. But that was 50 or 60 years ago. I've never been a print journalist, really. So why am I suddenly writing headlines as if they're newspaper headlines? So yeah, that's just a kind of simple example of, yeah, that's weird. Why do we do that? And actually, people very rarely ask that question. But even if they do, there's not the critical mass of people who think, oh, yeah, that's weird. And there's an interesting article actually by a guy called Rasmus Nielsen, who is head of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. And he talking in general about kind of the research I'm doing. He talks about the vanguards and the rear guards in newsrooms, which can probably exist in, lots of people's jobs. So there's a rear guard who essentially want to keep things the same. They've got no interest in things changing. And the reason they've got no interest in things changing is because the way it is privileges them. It privileges their outlook on the world. So if you're a white, middle-class, 50-year-old editor of the 6 o'clock news, why would you want there to be more stories about people from an ethnic minority or young people? Because suddenly you're not the expert on that. So why would you be the editor of the 6 o'clock news? Why wouldn't they get someone who did understand those communities to be the editor of the 6 o'clock news? And obviously the vanguards, who, even though I'm not that young, are people like me, women, young people of ethnic minorities, who are deprivileged by the way news is done currently, aren't reflected, aren't represented. And obviously we have a vested interest in changing that. I mean, I think there's a kind of a reason things should be better, because actually we do need to. Journalism is about reflecting all our communities, and we talked about journalism. We should be asking what journalism is for, and one of the key kind of characteristics of a journalist, I think, should be that we look beyond our direct experience. But again, too few people do that. So I've had people say to me in the Sky newsroom, colleagues say, "You don't get racism anymore, do you?" As if there wasn't racism anymore. Now that's horrifying on many, many levels, but mainly on the big picture. If you're a journalist and you don't think racism exists, why would you do any stories about racism? Why would you choose to do a story about racism on the 6 o'clock news or 10 o'clock news if you don't think it exists? So yeah, just simple examples, but really important, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm drawing parallels here with wider society, Shirish, because, like you say, I like to ask the question in anything I come across in life: who benefits from this system being as it is? And it's the people in power. It's the status quo. It's maintaining a preferred state of being for the people at the top of the pyramid. That's the same with pretty much any organisation, any system, I would suggest. And the other thing that's coming to my mind around change, when you try and bring in change, my personal experience from the different careers I've had in teaching and in financial services and the employment service and all pretty much everywhere I've worked is they do things a certain way because that's the way they've always done them. And sometimes they will pay some consultants to come in and say, okay, why do you do it that way? Why don't you do it this way instead? It's better, it's more efficient, it's more productive, it's going to serve your customers better, it's going to serve your staff better. So sometimes it is about getting that external perspective, I think, and sometimes it's just a case of not being able to see the wood for the trees, and this is how it's always been, this is how it will always be. But it's great that you're coming from that angle of change and how can we do things better.
And one of the things I've done is I've deliberately, in my research, spoken largely, not exclusively, but I'd say 80% of the people I've spoken to are people who don't work in news. So people like game designers, poets, puppeteers, people who tell stories, but tell stories in different ways. And I've talked about their own understandings of news, because they are all very talented, thoughtful people. So it's useful to get their perspectives, but really mainly to get what do you see in your industry that helps you tell stories. And so, for example, spoke to a guy called Sam Barlow, who's quite a well-known designer in the games world, and he tells sort of non-linear, well, he makes non-linear storytelling games, really. And he talked about how we actually crave complexity. And actually, people in the news industry, I mean, yeah, I'm forever being told as a journalist, oh, don't make anything longer than 2 minutes and make sure it's really super clear. People don't use the word dumbed down, but that's what they mean, because young people can't watch anything longer than 2 minutes and, they're stupid, essentially. And that's just not true. Actually, all the TV they watch is hyper complex. So things like Game of Thrones are they've got multiple storylines. And people don't say, oh, well, young people don't like Game of Thrones. They don't understand it. People want to make more things like Game of Thrones. So why is the news some special case where we can't do complexity, for example?
Yeah, that is very interesting, because I think stimulation comes from that complexity. And sometimes we do just want a bit of fluff and down for half an hour of easy sitcom. But the news, I think, is crucial in giving us an understanding of what's going on in the world. If it is just, as it is now, here's a quick snapshot of this thing, and we're not going to go into any detail, we're not going to tell a story about it, we're just going to go, here's a crisis headline, and then when that story drops off, that's gone, there's no arc, there's no story circle to it, then, as you said to me last week, there's no, it doesn't help us understand the world better.
No. And I think that's a really crucial point that I've come to in my research. And it sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but the key principle that I've come to is that news should be about orientating us in the world. That's the kind of phrase I've kind of hit upon. And what by orientation, I mean, when we read a story, so for example, the prototypes I'm making as sort of the end stage of my research, I'm doing around the story of HS2. And just because it's kind of quite a neutral thing, which has had a relatively long timeline. And the way I'm thinking about it is we should be able to, once we consume a piece of journalism, understand the key issues, the pros, the cons, the good, the bad. We should be able to form an opinion on the basis of that. We should feel confident to engage in conversations with friends, relatives, loved ones, listen to other views and synthesize them with the information we've got. And crucially, I think, we should be able to make a decision on what we think, which aligns with our interests and our self-interest and a community interest. And the reason I kind of couch it in those terms is, so I live in South Wales, and I don't want to kind of talk about Brexit in much detail, but I think what's clear around here is that lots of people, for various reasons, largely because we don't have a Wales-based media, made decisions in that vote which didn't align with their own interests or the interests of their family and friends, because they weren't well enough informed. And I don't mind what decisions people make if they're well informed, and because people have different views, that's great. But actually people were making decisions based on not being informed, which didn't align with their own interests. And that to me is a massive problem, because then it only stores up trouble for everyone down the line.
Yeah.
But principle of orientation is crucial, I think. And I think it sounds obvious, but if you watch the 10 o'clock news tonight, I think you would probably only find, if you were lucky, you'd find one piece which actually fulfilled any of those criteria. And that is a massive problem.
Mm. Yeah, I agree. And I think Brexit's an excellent example. And what came to my mind whilst you were saying that, Shirish, was around the BBC in particular, that they have to be balanced.
Mm-hmm.
So in their coverage of Brexit, they had to talk about the pros, they had to talk about the cons, but a lot of that was based on false information and misleading stuff that was coming out of the political parties and other pressure groups. So do you personally have an opinion on the BBC and how the BBC does news along with this having to give balance? There's something, I'll just pipe on for a moment, about something that's very close to my heart, which is the environmentalism.
Mm-hmm.
And when, I think up until probably last year, it was always a debate about whether climate change was happening, whether it was man-made, and whether we could do anything about it. Partly, I think, because the BBC had to offer some time to these scientists or pseudo-scientists who were saying, oh no, it isn't happening, or it's not a man-made thing, there's nothing we can do about it. And it's only, I think, in the past year or so that most people are now on board that, yes, it is happening, it is man-made. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, to go back to the question, do you have an opinion about the BBC and the balance that they have to show?
So I suppose I've got two or three things to say, but which I would say in a sense are kind of more widely, because actually all the broadcasting is regulated in the same way. So actually ITV have to be, balanced and neutral, and Channel 4 News do, and Channel 5 News. So it's all the same. But there are two or three things I'd say about that. What I would say, first of all, is that there are an enormous number of conspiracy theories around journalism right now. And having worked in newsrooms for 25 years, I can say 100% there's no kind of left-wing or right-wing conspiracy. Any kind of issues are entirely cock-up rather than conspiracy. And there are plenty of cock-ups. There are plenty of mistakes. And I think the most kind of persistent kind of thing is that there's some kind of right-wing cabal in the BBC. And truthfully, if people want the truth on that, there are probably far more left-leaning journalists than there are right-leaning journalists in the BBC. That's just, essentially factually correct. So yeah, it would be weird if there was some kind of weird right-leaning cabal that was controlling the news to kind of maintain, status quo, or present a kind of leave picture if we're talking Brexit terms. So that's just the kind of literally the realpolitik of it. So it's more cock-up than conspiracy, and there's no real kind of political agenda. Journalists generally are just trying to do, particularly in broadcast, newspapers are an entirely different ball game, and I think people will understand that. But the other thing I would say is that that the issues around balance and stuff like that largely come from the kind of phenomenon of 24-hour news, where you have 24 hours to fill, and so lots of that is taken up with having guests and panel debates. So you might have a presenter and 2 or 3 guests, in a kind of 5-minute slot, discussing, whatever issue it is, whatever issues there are in the news. So, and that becomes a really big part of 24-hour news. And again, this falls into a little bit, that's the way we've always done things. There is a preference, and again, this isn't conspiracy, this is just, that's how we've done journalism, to have kind of exciting, and I'm going to do those, exciting panel discussions where there's a bit of controversy or something like that. And that really militates against anyone sort of in the middle ground who's just being sensible, frankly. Because you'll get people on both sides who are at the extremes, and that's why, you see the kind of essentially the grift of people like, I don't know, Toby Young on one side, or even, people like Owen Jones on the other. And, people will disagree with my characterization of those. But these are people who are essentially just selling themselves as people who can put out, a kind of a voice that will be controversial and exciting in, broadcast environments. But actually, I don't think that's where 95%, maybe even more of us are at. We're somewhere in the middle and just want better information.
Yeah, it is incredibly polarizing to present the news or any kind of current affairs program in that way.
Yeah.
My sense is that society is becoming more polarized. Since Brexit and various other political events over the past few years, it seems to me that people are aligning themselves with the alt-right or the traditional left and these extreme views. And like you say, there's a lot of sense in the middle. But that apparently doesn't gain viewers, or certainly the people that are commissioning programs and news don't see it that way.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because I think there's a disconnect there, because people in the industry aren't really doing much sort of quantitative analysis in a way of that. And so there's a view that, complex things won't sell to young people. But that's not really borne out by any evidence. It's just that's the kind of thing that's in people's minds in the industry. So yeah, we have to have something controversial, otherwise people won't watch. But no one's done any A/B testing on that and had just sensible, informed people who see both sides no one's actually done that A/B testing. And actually, I think they'd be surprised if they did. But the problem is, if you say in a meeting, well, can we just have this guy who sees both sides? People would laugh in your, and sort of have laughed in my face on that. And like I say, until you get to a critical mass of people who are thinking differently in that way. And as I say, I don't think there's anything nefarious about that. It's just a kind of unthinking acceptance of the status quo, and that's the way we've always done things. But it's not helping us understand the world, frankly.
No, like you said earlier, Shirish, about being given the facts in a mindful, balanced way so that we can make up our own mind.
Yeah.
How it affects us, how it affects our societies, and what we really think about this particular.
Yeah. So it's really interesting, actually, that, as I say, I've been doing this work around HS2 to make my prototypes. And so I'd read quite a lot of journalism about it, as it's gone along. But I sort of went back to basics and kind of read all the source material. So I actually read all of the Oakervie review, which was the review that came out in January, on which the decision of whether to go ahead or not was based. And I was absolutely horrified, because I had seen basically none of the kind of important facts in it reflected in any journalism. And the journalism was very, very superficial. So interestingly, the strategic case for HS2 is based on kind of rebalancing the North and South. There's been no economic modelling of that. And the Oakervie review points this out. There's been no economic modelling, so no one knows, actually. And the research that has been done elsewhere points to the fact that actually people from away from the centre can just get to the centre quicker, so end up working in the centre more than they do, in the kind of, so, work in Brussels rather than in Liège, because there's a fast rail network to Liège. So that's really fascinating. Just little things like the journey between London and Birmingham, there'll only be 8 minutes which has a view, because the rest is in tunnels or surrounded by sound deadening kind of barriers. And that's just, little details, but which actually point, is that, because our well-being isn't really measured in just time. And actually on that, speed isn't the point of HS2. It's called HS2, high speed 2, but speed isn't the point of HS2. It's actually to create capacity on the rest of the network to kind of, so there's more space for kind of local commuter trains and stuff like that. Never talked about.
Yeah, I read an article about that a couple of weeks ago, that is the main benefit. It's not that it will get people like me from Manchester to London every Wednesday 25 minutes quicker. It's that the people on the more local lines will have better capacity, better reliability, and more frequent trains to get them where they're going to go. So, yeah, it's interesting that quite often the media will pick up a headline.
Yeah.
It's going to cut journey times from north to south and the northern powerhouse and all this, but actually that isn't the main benefit. It is not going to have a massive impact on people's lives. Yeah, good example.
That's a really good point. That's exactly it. It's you're taught as a journalist in journalism school to look for what's called the top line, which is literally the top line. What's the kind of thing that's going to grab people, and usually that's some big figure or some big. And this in a way speaks a little bit to that kind of discussion we had about guests, because actually saying something important, but that isn't a big figure or isn't shocking or whatever, isn't seen as a very good kind of top line. But actually that's often the information we need, and actually, on your point about, the wider network, HS2 has been planned as a standalone. There's been no thought of it fitting into an integrated transport network in the planning, and that's all in the Oakervie review. And the decision to go ahead is largely based on the fact they've already spent £9 billion.
So all that information is there.
Yeah,
done the research. You've found that out. Why is it not getting onto the news and to the public in some way?
Yeah, so I think it's partly that kind of what it's not seen as exciting, but actually the question I would ask is, do we want exciting news or do we want useful news? And secondly, and another of the issues I've been looking at is we massively in news prioritize what has happened on the day. We prioritize breaking news over explaining news. And so, seen as, there's enormous competition. I worked at Sky for 15 years. There's enormous competition to be the first to beat BBC News 24, or the BBC News Channel as it is now, in saying the thing that's just appeared on the Press Association wire service. That's just a mechanical task. It's just reading something that's popped up on everyone's wire service at the same time. But actually what's more important is, how do we put that in context? How does that fit into the overall picture? Because actually often, if say for example on the day of that HS2 thing, the BBC News story says Prime Minister gives HS2 the go-ahead. Now I was doing a workshop on that day with some journalism students. One of the journalism students said, I don't know what HS2 is. And that's a journalism student. So it's really brave of her to say that in a journalism environment. But actually, if that's journalism students, then probably hundreds of millions of people, well, in the UK, probably 40 million people maybe don't know what HS2 is, but we assume that knowledge. And so we have to give people entry points which deprioritize what's happened today, because that doesn't give us an understanding of the longitudinal scope of a story, where we can kind of understand what it means in the big picture. So I was reading Philip Pullman's book on storytelling, how he tells stories, and he talks about how he never uses the present tense, because he said it's like those vertical blinds, which give you a kind of vertical slice through a horizontal life. So they give you that tiny section, but actually what you want is the whole window to be opened. And I think that's a really good analogy for what we do with breaking news. And actually, we want to know what the full picture is. We want to be able to see out of the whole window.
Yeah, so the history, the thing that lies behind the issue that's presenting today, and also the future of what might happen, what are the options.
Exactly, and so one of the other prototypes I've built is a kind of contextual timeline, which actually starts in 1964 with the introduction of high-speed rail in Japan. Because, for instance, one of the other big issues is, why are we so terrible at high-speed rail? Japan's had it for nearly 60 years, and very successfully. Like, why are we so bad at it? But it starts there. It goes through when it's been introduced in France. America is actually pretty bad, but it's a very different geography. But it also looks ahead to, so in theory, the second parts of HS2 to Manchester and Leeds will be finished in 2040. But actually, particularly in Northern Rail, you need better rail services right now, because sitting around for 20 years waiting for better rail services is no good to people now. They're already massively overcrowded and delayed. So what's going to happen in the interim?
Mm.
And so we talk about that. And actually, that maybe gives people the power to think, oh yeah, we do need that now. I need to get into kind of campaigning for this. And maybe saying that £100 billion could be better spent, in creating a network for the whole of the UK, frankly, because the Southwest gets nothing from HS2. And £100 billion, so I was looking this up because also we need to give better context for big figures like that. If you're starting from scratch, you could electrify the whole of the rail network twice over. So, that's the whole of the UK-wide rail network, including Northern Ireland, which also gets nothing from HS2, but people in Northern Ireland pay for it.
Mm-hmm. So again, it's that contextualization, isn't it, Shirish, about how it affects individual people's lives. And if we're given that kind of context on the news, like this is how much it's going to cost, these are the benefits, these are the potential negative aspects of it, and here are some other options of what we could do instead. It empowers people, like you said at the beginning, to make up their own mind, rather than just say, oh, HS2 is this thing, it's going to cost this huge sum of money and we'll get to London 25 minutes quicker.
And that reminds me of a really important point as well. So, for example, the coverage around the budget, always the kind of central pillar is, how much better off would you be? Which sounds great. It sounds like it's really helping us understand the news. So, you'll be £15 a month better off. That doesn't tell us anything at all, because actually we may think, well, actually I want to pay more taxes. I want the NHS to be better funded. I want, education to be better funded. I don't want to spend so much money on defence. So I might be better off if I have less money. And that's never considered.
Mm.
We're told that, so essentially that is feeding a narrative, isn't it? Because that is feeding a small state narrative, which is fundamentally right wing, I suppose, if you want to kind of really, that's a very big kind of generalization. But you could argue that that is a kind of fundamentally a kind of right wing free markety kind of worldview, where we're better off if we personally have more money in our pockets. Now, we're gradually, as a side, moving to think that well-being isn't just based around money. But that kind of coverage reinforces a narrative where money is the only way we measure well-being. And actually, we do need to present it with the trade-offs. If I spend this much on Trident, then that's money that I'm not spending on the NHS or education or whatever. And, maybe what's happening right now will be part of the kind of re-evaluation of those. I'm not that hopeful, to be honest. I think people very quickly flip back into their kind of normal mindsets, but we'll see. I hope it does change. But.
Yeah. I'm reminded of one occasion when this is to do with council tax, and whenever a new council tax bill is landing on your doormat, the headline is council tax has gone up by 1.5%. And everyone goes, oh gosh, why are they spending this money and stuff? One year, I was emailed, I think, a kind of survey of how much do you want to spend on these local council services, and how much would you like to put in extra to do the bins and the streetlights and education and social care and all that stuff. So you could get feedback how much extra you'd be prepared to pay. And I thought that was firstly really empowering, and secondly a really forward-thinking thing to do, because it's looking at the story beneath the council tax bill, rather than just saying, here's a headline, 1.5%, that's going to cost you this much extra.
And that's another big failing of the news. And another of the principles I've kind of identified is really giving us, people, agency. And so that's both as kind of inputs and outputs. So we should be pointed to kind of ways we can engage with a story, how we can make a difference, because then it feels less hopeless. But also on the way in, when we do vox pops, for example, and I hate vox pops, and I largely don't see the point. But when we do, say, a good example again around rail, I suppose, is because the 1st of January is always a quiet time for news. We always do the story around how rail fares have gone up, because there's a function by which they go up by the rate of inflation on the 1st of January. So the vox pops are always, do you think rail fares should go up? And everyone says no, because no one wants anything to go up. If we ask the question, do you think there's a better mode of ownership for the rail system? That's a different question. And actually then people have the opportunity to suggest solutions or answers, or say, well, actually, yeah, this is working better because it's publicly owned. So actually, like the rail service in Northern Ireland is publicly owned and has had a massive resurgence in recent years. Whereas we have a franchise system largely. That has changed because of coronavirus. But the general point is, give people, even when vox pops, or even the way we as members of the public are portrayed, present us as agents in the world, not just subjects. So the news isn't just happening to us. We can have an impact on the world.
Yeah.
Rather than just the news is happening to you. What do you make of that? Yeah.
We're part of the story. And again, it is about explaining and understanding that people can get complex things like Game of Thrones, rather than here's the headline. So are you aware of the poet Mark Nepo at all?
No.
I'm a big fan of his, and he comes up with these little nuggets that really stick with me. And I heard a podcast with him the other day, and he said, we are addicted to the noise of things falling apart.
Yeah.
And that made me think of how the news is being done at the minute. It's that flash, here's the noise, here's this big thing that's happening right now, without that context, which I think we've covered already. So on to how we can do it better. So we kind of touched on the story arc. Do you want to elucidate on that a bit more, Shirish?
Yeah, so I think, actually there's starting from scratch in a way. So news, again, is largely done in what's called an inverted pyramid structure. So by that I mean that all the key information is kind of top loaded in the beginning of the story. So we have the headline, which will often tell you kind of everything you need to know about the story. But certainly the first paragraph or two will tell you almost everything you need to know in that story. And again, this is one of those things that's just because it's the way we've always done it. But it actually goes back to the Telegraph, the days of the Telegraph, because telegraph lines were very expensive and often kind of broke up. So people, when they're transmitting news over the telegraph, would try and get as much information into the beginning of their story as possible. But now, so, we just do that because that's the way we've always done it. But now, weirdly, now we live in an online world. People who do like the metrics at news organizations are always devastated when people only read a story for 10 seconds. Well, why would you read any more? Because you've got the information you need. Now, I'm sort of advocating telling stories in a more linear way, where you start at the beginning and end at the end. And in a way, start in the way traditional stories are told, where they're kind of once upon a time, and then you get a conclusion at the end. And there's a number of reasons I do. I kind of think that's kind of positive and powerful way to do it. But largely it's kind of evolutionary anthropological way, because stories are very important in culture and have been for thousands of years. And stories originated as a kind of, I guess, an evolutionary tool in a way as virtual reality simulators for life. So actually, when we told stories in caves, they were stories to kind of prepare us for what happens if a mammoth turns up at the entrance to the cave. What do I do? So you'd be told a scary story about the mammoth turning up at the entry to the cave, and fairy tales are a kind of evolution of those stories. But they're told because they're virtual reality simulators for the world. And actually, in a way, that's what journalism should be. It's helping us understand the world, find our place in it, and know what to do when something happens. In a way, that comes back to that principle of orientation. So we're actually hardwired for stories in our brains. That's part of kind of evolution. So if you watch a film, we cry at a film, because we're experiencing that film as if it's real, as if it's happening to us. So actually, that's a really important thing to start with when we're telling stories. Now, that inverted pyramid is the opposite to the way we are hardwired for stories at that evolutionary level. So our brains don't really understand the way that story is told. And I say that's before you get into the kind of the editorial problems we've talked about. That's just, we don't really understand the story. So that's a good reason not to do it that way. But also, we talk about story arc. And I think what's really important and what we miss is we don't get any kind of resolution to our stories if we just read that first headline or the first two paragraphs, because we don't get that broader sense, and we're left with just that picture of crisis often, as you've described it, without any of the resolution. And that's not good for mental health, which is, I know what you've been discussing in all of these, the reason we find the news overwhelming is because we don't get any of that kind of resolution. We don't understand where we are. Again, it comes back to orientation. We're lost in that space and we don't know where we are or where we're going.
So that's very prescient at the moment, isn't it, with the coronavirus thing? And what we're getting is lots of death figures, lots of criticisms of how the government are handling it, and lots of warnings around what you need to do and what people aren't doing. I assume, anyway, I haven't watched the news for years, but I see headlines on the BBC website and such like. So, yeah, I've spoken to a lot of people who are feeling overwhelmed by the news, and certainly in the first couple of weeks of the pandemic, it was having negative impacts upon their mental health and general well-being. So, certainly the way you're advocating for news to be changed sounds to me much more aligned with who we are as people. It sounds a lot more aligned with us being able to understand things in a broader context, and also having that resolution as well.
Yeah, and I think in a way, coronavirus isn't a great example because the truth is we don't know what the resolution is going to be, and that's partly the problem for us. And it's I think it's totally natural to feel very concerned about what is a global crisis, but look, I'm a journalist, and even before all this, I was withdrawing from the news, and everyone I've spoken to around this project, including the journalists, is withdrawing from the news. So that tells us we're doing something wrong. If even journalists can't bear it, then that's kind of obvious, isn't it, that we're doing something wrong? Because how can we expect regular folk to watch the news if even journalists can't watch it?
Yeah, it's a good point. And I totally get your point around the pandemic not being a great example, because at the moment there are so many unknowns, and we can't say, well, we could do this and we could do this. Here are the options. It's just a big unknown, which we're not comfortable with generally as human beings. So what tips do you have, Shirish, around maintaining positive mental health during this crisis and with our news consumption throughout it?
Yeah, well, so I'm very much a people kind of choosing the solution to fit their own personality and so on. But I think it is very easy, and even I've done this, even though I kind of know better, really, is because there is a constant, there are constant updates on the BBC website. You feel like maybe you should watch the briefing every day because it's important, and you might find out something. The truth is, nothing about the story is moving fast, actually. And I think we need to kind of remind ourselves of that we can get by with only watching 10 minutes of the news or only reading 10 minutes of the news, because actually this is a really good example of a story that isn't moving fast. Nothing's going to change quickly. Even if we come out of lockdown, there'll be a gap of a week between when it's announced and when we're actually out of lockdown. So we're not going to miss anything. But it is very, very easy to get dragged into that kind of quicker news cycle. And things like Twitter and Facebook kind of feed that. But they feed it in that kind of same endorphin rush, which kind of addicts us to things like Twitter and Facebook. What I've done, actually, and it's a really simple thing, but on my phone, I've taken off the little badges you get on all your apps, so which tell you how many emails you've got, or if you've got any notification on Twitter. So I still have the apps there, but I've taken off the badges, so I don't get that endorphin or adrenaline rush when I see a badge pop up. I look at my Twitter when I want to look at it, not when I'm kind of primed to look at it by the app. So I suppose I've gone back to using it as a tool rather than it controlling me. Because I'm not one of those people who thinks, the internet is bad, social media is bad, they're all negative, influences on our life. I'm not at all one of those people. I'm wholly for progress and wholly for connection, because I think they're amazing tools for connection. But I think using them as a tool rather than them kind of controlling you, triggering you, is kind of good. So that tip of just taking the badges off has been really useful to me.
No longer a Pavlov's dog, you are in control and doing it at a time that suits you. And I like your tip as well around just restricting yourself to 10 minutes of news, which is kind of what I do. I check the headlines at the beginning of the day, check them at the end of the day, and that's it. Don't watch anything. I feel a lot more liberated now that I have control. I'm not responding to this constant stream, because it is now, isn't it? It's 24/7 news and social media feeds.
Yeah. And in that way, if we were told kind of fairy stories all day, in which kind of the wolf ate someone, 300 times a day, we'd probably get a bit kind of overwhelmed by that, because again, they're the stories which are, meant to kind of protect us by telling us the bad things that can happen in the world. But we don't want to hear that all the time. We're not hardwired for that either. We want to hear, happy endings as well.
Yeah, yeah. I could go off on a massive tangent here and talk about Jungian psychology, because he's got to say about fairy tales, what they have to tell us about ourselves as metaphors. But I won't go there. We're talking about. So trigger warning for the audience if you're watching live or if you're going to watch it later. We are going to have a chat with Shirish now about his own mental health journey, which involves some suicidal ideation and self-harm. So thank you, Shirish, for agreeing to share your own journey. I think by doing so, it can normalise mental health issues and people can connect with you as a person, connect with themselves and recognise their own experiences. So over to you to explain as much as you wish to do.
Yeah, well, I think on that point, I think it's really, really important to kind of talk about, difficult mental health situations, because I think, too often people can look at people who they think are, I don't know, and I'm not describing myself in this, but people who look successful or popular or whatever, and think, oh yeah, that, people don't, I'm the weirdo, and there's all these successful people out there who never have any of these problems, and it's just me on my own kind of going through this. And so I've had, I guess, pretty serious mental health issues. So I guess I've always struggled with depression from when I was very young, really. So I had not an ideal childhood, let's say. I had a pretty bad relationship with my parents, and lots of that was pretty abusive, I guess. And so I was attempting suicide, not that kind of professionally, I suppose, from the age of let's just say I was under 10 when I first attempted suicide, and that's I guess kind of shocking to people, but I don't think I'm unique in that. And I think young people's mental health is something I'm very concerned about. So I worked as a volunteer cancer at Childline for a long time, and I found that it's not unique at all, and it's useful, I think, for people to be aware of that and not shy away from those difficult realities. I suppose I then struggled with it kind of teenage years and into adulthood, and I guess the kind of worst episode was about 10 years ago now, where I had pretty serious depression, and ultimately was, so I spent more than a month in a kind of private mental hospital, because I was at the Sky at the time. So luckily, I suppose I had private medical insurance, and so I spent more than a month in a kind of private mental hospital, and then was off work for 3 or 4 months. But I'd say, I was lucky that I had that private medical insurance, because I went to see a GP and was told, we can refer you to counselling, but it'll be 6 months. And I can tell you right now that 6 months would have been too long. And, I spent, even, with all the help I got, I spent 3 years pretty solidly in a state of having constant suicidal thoughts for 3 years, 24/7. And during that time, I was going to work and kind of doing normal things, I suppose. But was having those thoughts, pretty much 24/7. And that's not a great place to be. But actually, people, not everyone knew. Most people probably didn't know that that's what I was kind of going through. And there's plenty of us weirdos out there. I use weirdos, with those, because I don't think we are weirdos. But it's easy for us when we're going through those to think, we are we're kind of abnormal, I suppose, in most people's view. But I think that view is changing. I don't think we're there yet in terms of the wider understanding of mental health and the kind of equivalence with physical health, or those sorts of things. But yeah, I think we're getting better, and actually we're a lot better now than we were 10 years ago. So actually, when I was off work, my manager, I don't really know why, told people I had a virus when I was off work. And then when I came back, I had to explain I didn't have a virus. And I don't think that would happen now. I think people would be more honest and, but yeah, without really asking me, thought that, I wouldn't want people to know, and that would be embarrassing or stigmatizing. And, it's that kind of thing which kind of reinforces stigma, I think, rather than kind of helping.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Shirish. And I'm reminded of a tale that we were told by our mental health first aid instructor, which is where we met when we were on that training course, around the equivalence of mental health now with physical health and physical disability. Back in the 70s and 80s, if you were in a wheelchair, you were very disabled because of society. It just wasn't set up. There weren't ramps to get into shops, restaurants, cinemas, all that type of stuff. And now, if you are in a wheelchair, you're not really that disabled by comparison. And that's the similar kind of journey that we're on with mental health and how society views it and the stigma around it. We're not there yet, but as you said, we are getting better.
Yeah.
Great stuff. So is there anything else that you would like to bring, anything that we haven't discussed that you think might be interesting?
No, I think we've covered everything very comprehensively.
Yeah, enjoyed that. That's a very interesting and stimulating chat. So thank you very much, sir.
Okay.
So I've got a link here to Shirish's articles on the topic of how to do news better and some of the research that you've done there, Shirish. Yeah, so check it out if you've been interested, and you might want to read a little bit further there. So all that remains is to say thank you again, and hope you continue to cope with the pandemic and lockdown as well as you can.
Yeah, you too. Thank you very much.
See you soon. Take care, Shirish. Lovely. What a great chat. So hope you enjoyed that, and maybe food for thought around your own news consumption during the pandemic and beyond, and maybe what can we do to educate ourselves about how we consume news and what we can do differently. I like the idea of news being a story, having a beginning, a middle and an end, rather than just this is what's happening right now, which isn't good for our mental health. So I shall reiterate once again that tomorrow I'm doing a mental health aware course, half day, 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. If you want to get on the bus, please do so tonight, or if not, first thing in the morning. If the £75 is a barrier for you, then please just send me a message. Don't feel ashamed. I would be very happy to offer concessions, payment plans, whatever is necessary to try and get this message out there to as many people as possible. It's a really good course. You can learn all about different mental health issues, how to spot them, how to support people, how to start a conversation using the right language, talking about mental health as a continuum, and how to support yourself and others with maintaining positive well-being. So give us a shout pronto if you fancy that. And in the meantime, if I can if I can find the right buttons on my screen, which has gone really tiny for some reason, I will play a song. Yeah, this is going to work, I think. So this is Jake Fletcher, and much like the news at the moment, the way it's done, this is called Feels So Wrong. The car wasn't coming to pick me up. There was an empty feeling in my head.
lump in my throat. We sat around waiting for things to come, but when you draw the line to make it move on, it's the hardest decision to move on. Ooh, we waited too long while we were stood still. Things are moving on when you cling to a seat.
Introduction to fractional shares.
What?
How to invest from just £1.
No, I don't want to invest.
The real world and it feels so wrong. All my friends have grown up, I still feel young. They have their own houses, I still live with my mom. That's okay, but I wonder if she's proud of her son fooling around. My head still sways, sometimes I lost the days. My head's down south, but my heart's never changed. We waited too long while we were stood still. Things were moving on when you cling to a seat. The less you belong to the real world, and it feels so wrong. We waited too long while we were stood still. Things were moving on when you cling to a seat. The less you belong to the real world, and it feels so wrong. Well, we waited too long. Oh, we waited too
Top banana. Hope you enjoyed that, folks, and hope you enjoyed the chat with Shirish. So enjoy the rest of your Thursday, if it is indeed Thursday that you're watching this, and hope to catch you tomorrow. Who have we got coming in tomorrow? Oh, it's me. Yes, I'm going to be doing Successfully Navigating Homeworking. 6:30 tomorrow, talking about productivity, how to set up your day to work as effectively as possible, how to juggle children, homeschooling, mental health, all that type of shenanigans, and we'll try and get through as much as we can. If you have any specific issues you'd like me to address, send me a message or a comment and I shall attempt to do so. Take care. Toodaloo. Bye-bye.